Hi everyone, my name is Armando and let's talk about the Pheek sequencer for a second. To get things started, you're going to want to turn this on switch on. So if this is at off, the sequencer will not work. You have to make sure that this is at on. And then you have to make sure that your Ableton transport is running. This is because the sequencer is actually tied to the transport that Ableton has, so it has to be playing for it to work. Next, let's just bring in a drum rack to get some sounds going. So I just grabbed a random drum rack, and still, despite having a sequence here, we're not seeing anything come out. Well, in this menu here, we have different tabs that give us access to different features within the sequencer. So we're gonna want to go to the probability tab, and in this tab, what we can do is set the probability for what the probability is for each note to be played. So right now the probability for every single note is 0, meaning that none of them will sound. So if I say I want all of the probability to be maximum, this will go up, and once we have a note, we'll be able to hear it. So the point in this tab is that, let's say that if I look at my sequence here, I'm going to write a more musical sequence first. So I'm going to make the probabilities be 100% right now so that I can always hear the note. And I'm going to make the sequence a bit faster. So I'm going to say that I want it to be at 16th notes. So that should be here. All right. So how good that sequence actually is, it's arguable, whatever, but it's musical enough. So the point with the probabilities tab here is that I might want to say, I want to hear this step only like around 25% of the time. So that's what this little tab here does. So if I bring it up again, pay attention here. So right now it played it, but that time it didn't. So that's the whole point of this tab. So a lot of people are having problems with hearing sounds from the sequencer. Most likely what's happening is that the probabilities are all down. So if I click on all minimum and I bring my volume up here, I'm not going to be able to hear anything because all of the probabilities are down. So this will create like interesting opportunities with variations with drum patterns, because like you could have a really complex drum pattern and only bring it in sometimes, or you could play with probabilities. Something else that we can see in the main page, in the notes page, is that we actually have 4 sequencers. Right now we're just seeing sequencer A. If I press on B, I'll see another sequence, and then it goes back to A. Why is this? Well, in this button right here, in this menu, if I click on it, it's going to take me to the sequencer that I want to go to after the current sequence is done. So to see this in action, if I press B here, and this sequence finishes, it goes to sequencer B. And that one had sequencer A as its instruction, so it'll go to sequencer A once B is done. Why is this useful? Well, it lets you chain different sequences together. So you could have up to 4 different sequences. So say that you want to chain them all 4 together, you could have, this has 16 steps, so you could have a 4 times 16 step sequence, and so on. And you could just have different permutations of this, which creates for interesting possibilities when composing rhythms. Let's look at some of the other features that we have in our main menu. I'm going to turn on the probability all the way up. So I'm going to hit max. So once we're in sequencer A, I'm going to say when it's done, go to sequencer A, meaning just stay where you are. Right here we have an option that lets you increase the swing. So something interesting in the swing is that right now we're not noticing it. That's because it only affects the offbeats. So let's see here. So right now I can hear the swing. If I go down here, we'll see that it's a very straight, like square sequence. And I can increase this to a ridiculous level if I just keep going up, where it sounds more like a flam than a swing. And that's just something you can play with. Okay, something else we see here is this number. So it says 0 right now, meaning that it's deactivated, but exactly what is being deactivated? Well, that's the mod. So this particular parameter, the swing parameter, can be modulated. So if I go to the mod tab over here, I have 4 different internal mod sources that I can use to control all of the parameters that I have within. So we have a sine wave, a triangle wave, a saw wave. Oh no, sorry, it's a sine wave, it's a saw wave, it's a reverse saw wave, it's a triangle wave, and noise. And this is the frequency. So we have 4, each with its own label, and a range. So if I want this to be full range modulation, I leave it as it is, and if I want the modulation to be smaller, I can select a different range, like so. So you just click and drag. So for example, let's say that I want to modulate my swing by this mod source 1. So I go back into the notes tab, and I say I want this to be modulated by 1. And then I'll go back to the modulation, and you'll see how this is moving to random spots. That's because I have a noise signal here, and it's getting a new noise value every second, for example, approximately every second right there. So that's essentially what this menu does. And that's also the case, by the way, with the probabilities. So you can also modulate the probabilities with different mod sources. So you, for example, could say, I want to modulate the first step's probability using mod 1. And that's what's happening right here. Okay, cool. Let's take a look at other options. Right here, well, before we go into this drums menu, we also see this option that says random and clear. The clear button just clears our sequence. So let's write it again. Just quickly. Okay, perfect. The random option has a number next to it, right? So if I just click on random, nothing will happen. However, if I say 5 or 6 random, it's going to introduce 6 random new notes. Yeah, if I keep pressing on it, it'll keep adding 6 new random notes. So let's hear it. That's a little bit too much, you know, but that's up to you to decide when you're using the tool. So let's just clear this for now. The drums menu is actually not a drums menu. It gives you 7 different scales, all of which are modes of a major scale. So, you know, you have like Ionian mode, just a major scale, and different variations of that. And what this means is that you can actually use this as a melodic sequencer as well. So, for example, let's say goodbye to our drums for a second, and I'll drag in an instrument, just operator for now, and I'll just leave it at a sine wave. It doesn't really matter right now. So I can write a sequence. Let's bring up the volume. And the cool thing about this is that it's always going to be in key. It's always going to be Ionian and in C. It's always going to be major in C. So we can make it more, you know, dark. We could say I want it to be in a Phrygian in A sharp. So you could see, you could hear how that changes the mode, right? It's basically changing the selection of notes that you have. So that's just a different feature that this sequencer has. It has a drum sequencing mode, which is where we started, and it also has a different melodic sequences. Let's look at some of the other features that are in this menu. We have 4 mapping options, one env, like envelope tab, and an envelope sequencer tab. So let's look at the mapping. The mapping is actually a really cool option. It lets you map any parameter in live to this sequencer, and then each step has a range of random variability. So let's take a look at what that means. I'm going to go back and introduce a drum kit. Okay, I'm going to hide all of these parameters. And let's say that I want to add a delay on the drums. I'm just going to use the built-in echo effect. Okay, good. So let's say that I'll have it with this mix level, so it's going to be relatively low, and let's say I want to modulate the delay time. So I'm going to have them synced, but I'm going to use the time option. So if I bring this up, I'll be able to hear this change in effect a little bit louder. Okay, so if I click here on the map option, it'll turn like some sort of white yellowy color. If I click on the parameter I want to map, I'll be able to map that. Okay, so right now the modulation range is huge. That's because it's mapping from the maximum point that parameter has to the minimum. So if I want to change just a little bit, I'll select just the top. So for example, if I just want to change it at around the maximum value of that parameter, I can just select that for each step. Okay, so what does that mean? Now you see how this only is moving near the top. That's because this random range selection means that every step will give you a random value for that mapping, but it's only going to be within the range that you selected for each step. This also has a randomize button, so you can randomize the range for each step as well. And you can also automate the randomization. Now, this is the case for all of these other parameters as well, so you can map up to 4 parameters per instance of this device. So you could either map, effects that you add on top, or sense, or you could even map parameters in other tracks if you want. So if you want to have like some sort of interesting conversation between two sequencers, you could absolutely do that. Let's look at the env option. This is a different mapping capability that this sequencer has, and what it does is that it offers you a pretty standard adsr feature here, where you can design your own adsr envelope, which can also be modulated, by the way, with the same mod sources as before, and you could map it to any parameter. So you see this light that blinks with activity? That's because we have a sequencer here. So let's go back to here. We see that we have actually 2 envelopes, right? And each of these envelopes have 4 different mappings. So each of these envelopes can be mapped up to 4 different parameters, meaning that if we're using all of the mapping features of this device, we can actually map up to 12 different parameters per instance. Okay, so now if I select the fill option here, that means that I'm going to get activities on every step of the sequencer, meaning that if I map this to, let's say, the panning over here, that's going to map that parameter with an ADSR. So that movement is following the ADSR parameters here. So let's actually hear that. And many of these mapping capabilities, I'm not necessarily showing the best examples ever. Like, I just wanted to prove a point, but you could map them to whatever you may want. And this sequencer tells you when that particular envelope is going to be used. So, for example, envelope 2 is just being used once at the beginning of the sequence, but envelope 1 is being used in every single step. So that's basically about it. It's a pretty deep sequencer with a lot of mapping capabilities. The mapping is a very deep tool that lets you create like a conversation between all of the different tools that you might have at a given time. I'm keen to see how people are using it, so if you want to share in the group any experiences or experiments that you might have, please do let us know. I hope you have fun. Thank you.